Professor Freeberg. You are Professor of Humanities and Head of the History Department at the University of Tennessee. You have written 3 award-winning books, and now you just published this one, A Traitor to His Species, Henry Bergh, and the Birth of the Animal Rights Movement. Professor Freeberg, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
So, as a self-declared vegan, and to see a book about the animal rights movement, this is a delight for me. So, thank you so much. I'm sure there are thousands of vegans right now saying thank you for bringing this issue to light. Before we get started, I would like to ask you a little bit about your background. Where do you come from? How do you get into academics, and then what inspired you to become an author?
Yeah, well, I grew up in New England, outside of Boston, and I was an English major in college, and I wanted to be a writer. And I got out of college and became a journalist, and I was working for Maine Public Broadcasting when I was in my 20s. But what I discovered as a journalist was that I was not well prepared to handle all the issues that were coming at me every day, covering all these different, the issues of the day, because everybody coming to talk to me, trying to convince me of their position, was invoking some version of the past in order to justify what we should do in the present and in the future. And since I was an English major, I knew a lot more about English literature than I did about history, and I felt like this was a real gap. I couldn't really keep people honest. So I thought if I went to graduate school and studied history, I would be able to understand what actually happened in the past. Turns out the past is a lot more complicated than I thought. And so the no easy answers to be found in graduate school. But at least that's what led me to think that I should, not just be a writer, but be a writer who thinks about history.
And when you focus on history, were you focusing on a particular geographical area and a particular frame in time?
Well, I'm an American historian. I think that partly because of the questions that I was dealing with as a journalist were coming out of that area. I think a lot of what I've done has to do with thinking about things that are going on in the present and looking back to where is an interesting place to think about when the conversation started. So my previous work has been about our ideas about disability and disability rights, about our fascination with technology and our sort of love-hate relationship with technology, the ideas about free speech in times of war. And all of those, those are very current issues for us today. And I went back and tried to say, well, where does this, in some ways it starts as far back as you want to go. But, where is an interesting place to start? And for me, the late 19th, early 20th century, with the rise of cities and immigration issues and, a lot of this ideas about modern government, all of them emerge in this time period. So I think that's why I keep going back to that 19th, early 20th century period.
One phrase that I hear often in the media is the word unprecedented. Unprecedented this and unprecedented that. But as we look back into history, nothing is unprecedented, not even the animosity between one political party and another one. People say, oh, we have never been to this level of animosity before in history, and that is not true. Oh, there have never been so much inequality in history, and of course, that is not true. So yeah, it's a worn-out phrase,
yes.
And only through the story of history, we see that all these unprecedented things happen all the time.
That's right. It's all about precedents. That's certainly true.
Okay, so you wanted to be a journalist, you saw the gap, and then you decided to study a little bit history to be better informed. Then how is it that you got into academics?
Well, I went to graduate school, I think, just largely to sort of fill those gaps. And I think in the course of that time, the beauty of being a journalist, and as a person doing the work you're doing, is you get to learn about all different kinds of things, and you dip in and you move on to another interesting thing. And that's a wonderful way to feed your mind, But the difference is with academia, I was given the other alternative, which is to dive in deeply into one topic for years. I mean, each one of these books took me 5 or 6 years to write, and there's something really very satisfying about that opportunity to think something through, wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it, get to travel around the country and go to the archives that help you feed that information and try to pull it all together in a way that reaches other people. That's a great experience. So once I went to the university, it seemed like that was going to be a nice way to do what I wanted to do anyway, which was to write about current issues.
Okay, perfect. So you have written 3 award-winning books, and could you tell us what's the title? What are the titles and what are they about?
Yeah, my first book it's called The Education of Laura Bridgman, the first deaf and blind person to learn language. It was the story, we think of the story of Helen Keller, and many people think of her as the first deaf and blind person to learn language, but in fact, this was much earlier in the 1830s. Samuel Gridley Howe, a reformer, was convinced this could be done. Many people thought there was nothing going on inside a deaf and blind person, that without any external environment, there would be nothing inside them. He was convinced there was something in there. He figured out how to reach her, and it became an enormously internationally famous moment. And in fact, Helen Keller, at the time when she first emerged, people said, "Oh, here is a second Laura Bridgman." That story got out a lot about disability rights and our ideas about disability and psychology. I then wrote a book about Eugene Debs, who was the socialist leader in the United States through the early 20th century, who was put in prison for an anti-war speech that he made in 1918. And the push to get him out of jail, which happened across the country, was one of the major social free speech movements in American history. He really produced our ideas about free speech in the United States. It's our modern free speech doctrine. And my third book is about electric light. It's called The Age of Edison, but it's not really about Edison. It's really about what happened after the light bulb left Edison's laboratory and the laboratory of many other inventors and went out into the world, and how people reacted to it and continued to invent the light bulb in a way. I call it the social invention of the light bulb, because people had to figure out what to do with it in ways that one inventor couldn't possibly. It changed theater, it changed downtown development, it changed surgery, changed sports.
Changed everything, yeah.
Changed everything, right?
Like the internet of that era.
Exactly, that's right. And in the same way, we think of, we often talk about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates as being people who gave us the computer. But in fact, many people invented the computer, and the computer is still being reinvented as we speak, right? And so that was sort of the idea with electric light, something we take for granted as just there, how important it was, and how creative people have been using electric light.
And now we arrive to this time where you just wrote Traitor to his species. What motivated you to write this one?
I think it was looking back. I spent a lot of time thinking about the United States and in cities in this time period, the late 19th century. And if you look at an image of a city back in those days, it's full of horses. Obviously, that was in the same way we see cars today. You would have seen horses, and the city was just full of animals. And that's something that changed profoundly. I think really, we've been talking about the word unprecedented, but I think in this case, maybe I'll use it. It's unprecedented that human beings really started to separate themselves from animals in a unique way. Cities had always been a mix of animals and human beings. In this period, by 1920, seeing an animal, it was a rare thing in cities, except for pets. Right? One historian has described the world we live in at least an urban environment, as we live with pets and pests. Yes. The animals we adore and lavish attention on, and the animals that we think should not be in our landscape, and we should try to get rid of them, right? And this is different than the way human civilizations developed.
Okay, so our main character, Henry Bergh, can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah,
yeah, his
yeah, fascinating,
lifestyle,
right.
his interests.
Yeah, that was really what made this, this topic fascinating for me, was to sort of trace it through the life of this very passionate, eccentric, and admirable man, Henry Bergh. He was the heir to an industrial fortune, and at the age of 50, he basically, he took that money as a young man and went off to Europe. He married another wealthy socialite, and they spent their most of their adulthood in the capitals of Europe, attending the theater. He wanted to be a playwright. He was apparently a terrible writer of maudlin verse and unwatchable plays and that sort of thing. But when he was in his 50s, 53 years old, he suddenly had this moment where he was the ambassador to Russia during the Civil War, and he saw a teamster beating a horse in the streets of St. Petersburg, and he just snapped and demanded that the man stop this. And because he was wearing his gold epaulets and lace as an ambassador, the person thought, "Wow, here's a person who's official. I better behave," and drop the whip. And so Henry Bergh said, "Wow, this transformed his life." He said, "Well, here's something useful I can do with the rest of my life," and he did. He came back to the United States, founded the ASPCA, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and spent the next 20 years battling against cruel behavior.
So you mentioned that this was towards the end of the Civil War. Can you give us, paint the picture of what was going on in America at that time? Can you place us,
Yeah.
if we were in New York at that time, what's the scenario like?
Right. Yeah. Well, two things. One thing is 1866 is relevant because the Civil War had just ended, and so the war against slavery, which was a war against cruel behavior, had just ended, and so there was a lot of energy around continuing a fight against cruelty. And so, not that human slavery and the treatment of animals is morally comparable, but in other ways, the anti-cruelty activists used a lot of the same ideas that the anti-slavery movement did. At the same time, cities are growing rapidly, and they're relying increasingly on the power of horses to build cities, to expand the cities through horse railroads. Cities are expanding, and people are bringing their animals with them. So cities are just a total chaos, really, of sanitation problems related to horse manure, livestock being, downtown Manhattan, there would have been big livestock pens, slaughterhouses, lots of packs of stray dogs roaming the streets. There was no real form of animal control that was not horrendously cruel. And so it was this real churning of humans and animals in this unprecedented way.
Yeah, one thing that caught my attention is that I would have guessed that Henry Bergh was an animal lover, but of course, one of the sentences that I get from the book is that Henry Bergh was not motivated not by unusual love for animals, but the hatred of human cruelty.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, people considered it they called him the riddle of the 19th century because they couldn't figure out what motivated him. And it really was a hatred of cruelty. He felt like cruelty was barbaric, that it was possible to stamp this out through law enforcement, possibly, and it's for him. It started with the protection of animals, but evolved also into support for protection of women and children against cruel behavior, almost always by men, right?
It seems like England was ahead of times in compared to the US, and he got his inspiration, or he went to England to kind of see how things are working in regards to the SPCA. Can you tell us about that time, and also how England was ahead of us in the abolition of slavery?
Right, that's right, and the two are linked, right? The Royal SPCA was founded in the 1820s, and it was founded by many people who were also involved in the anti-slavery movement. So that link between cruelty to animals and cruelty to human beings was there from the start in the 1820s. And so I think in the United States, they were always a bit behind in terms of reform movements. The European, especially the British innovators on reform, but also I think the United States was much more directly consumed by the war against slavery. So a lot of the reform energy in the mid-19th century in the United States was going to the war against slavery, and the war against animals sort of had to wait until the war against slavery was finished. One important thing that Bergh did, and he learned a lot from the Royal SPCA about the whole way to organize a movement, the kind of moral arguments you make to protect animals. The real innovation that he made was that he built into the law the appointment of agents who had badges, deputies whose job it was to go out and enforce the law. And this had not been done before. And it really gave the law some teeth. Suddenly it wasn't just asking people to be nice to their animals. It was the power to drag people into court, maybe throw them in jail, and certainly, issue them serious fines that forced everybody to start paying attention to animal cruelty.
So how was this, for example, how was those volunteers financed? Did the state give them a salary in order to be able to patrol the streets and look, or was it volunteer, I guess?
Well, I mean, there were thousands of people did volunteer and contribute funds. This was an interesting sort of quasi, it was authorized by the state, but it wasn't paid for by the state. So it was a sort of a transition to what we would think of as a modern ideas about the state using its power to protect the vulnerable. A lot of the money came from the fines I was talking about. The agents would go and fine somebody for whipping their horse or torturing a cat or whatever, and bring them to court, and there would be a fine, and half the money would go to the agent, and half the money would go to the society. So it was actually through this enforcement mechanism that the money came in to keep the society going.
And the state gave them that power to give those fines, and they were able to call the police and even make arrests themselves?
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes they call, if it was a big arrest, they would call in the police to help them. But other times the agents themselves would do it. They tried not to just arrest people. I mean, that was always a hard thing. One thing they said was, well, the law is really here to instruct people. People don't realize at first that this is even against the law, or people think this animal is my property.
Right.
It's nobody's business to tell me whether I should, I'm abusing it or not. I have the power to kill my animal. Why would I have to, not be allowed to treat it cruelly? So there was this provoked a real discussion in the courts, in the newspapers, and on the streets of the cities, about, well, what are the rights of animals? If we're able to still treat them as property, do they have any sort of rights? And Henry Bergh and his movement said, yes, they have at least this one right, the right not to be treated cruelly, not to be, pain inflicted on them that doesn't have to be inflicted on them.
Okay, so at the time, everyone could understand not beating a horse to death, for example, but he got a lot of media attention by other cases that at the time were not understood or were just thought of as ridiculous. Could you mention 2 or 3 of those cases?
Right, sure. I mean, I think that was another, in addition to the agents, the other really important thing that Bergh did was his law said, we're going to protect horses, livestock, and other animals. And most people who supported that law, and most people did support the law. I mean, nobody was really in favor of cruelty, so it was easy to pass a law. The real trick was when Bergh said, when I said other animals, I mean all animals. Right. So his first big celebrity case was protecting turtles who were being shipped from Key West in the holds of ships. In order to transport them, they were flipped upside down. There was a rope driven through their flippers to sort of contain them, and they were deprived of food and water for sometimes weeks on their way north. So Bergh arrested a ship captain for cruelty to turtles, and it was the first big celebrity controversy where people said, "Wait a minute, animals? We're protecting animals, but turtles? Come on! I mean, they're not animals, And Bergh went to court and said, "Look, it's animal, vegetable, or mineral. They're animals, right? And the law protects animals, and so Surely this counts. And the defense said, well, turtles hardly feel anything. It's what we can recognize that horses are intelligent, sensitive animals. Turtles, they don't know whether they're being suffering or not. And so there was an interesting debate about the limits of this. Bergh lost that case, and he lost many cases about turtles. He kept trying again and again to arrest turtle dealers. But he said always that, well, at least it caused everybody to pay attention. It was so outrageous that, and the worst thing for a social movement is for it to be ignored, right? And so he did that. He went after pigeon shooters. The elite would shoot pigeons for target practice and tournaments, and he took on the wealthy elite as pigeon shooters. He stopped people from dogfighting, cockfighting. The rat pit, which was a popular entertainment where rats would be thrown into a pit and terrier dogs would go after them and try to kill them as fast as possible. Again, people said, you're claiming rats have rights here, and Bergh's argument was, well, yes, the rats have rights. All creatures have the right not to be terrorized, but also that cruelty is bad for human beings.
Right.
It's the same argument that anti-slavery people made, that slavery is terrible for the enslaved person, but it also corrodes the soul of the master, right? That sort of outrageous power.
Just give me a second. I just got a UPS delivery.
Okay.
Just 1 second. Sorry about that. I got another book. Okay. So he started this movement at age 53, at a time in history where life expectancy was not that long. I wonder if he managed to see the fruit of his work while he was still alive. Did he see any significant change on people on the treatment of animals, or did he just die without any results for all his efforts?
That's a really good question, and I think you can read it either way. On the one hand, when he died, almost every state in the Union had adopted a law modeled on his law, and there were many societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals in states and cities across the country and in Canada. So certainly that was a success. I think people in the streets said, people tend to be kinder to animals. There was a big push to educate children to be kinder to animals, and people felt like that was having an effect. On the other hand, if you look at the issues that he was dealing with about, the origins of factory farming and the euthanizing of stray animals, and in many of these cases, a lot of the issues are still with us. So, he started the conversation. I think he had some real successes. Along with others who joined that movement, but we're still heirs to the same controversies and quandaries, I think.
Right. I took a moment to look at the website of the SPCA right now, and the only issues that I see right now is how to take care of your dog and cats. I don't see anything else about any other kind of animal. So do you know what's been the evolution since his time until today in regards to the protection of animals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one thing that's evolved is that there are many organizations. The SPCA is just one of many. Some of them more specialized. Some are working specifically on factory farming issues. Some are, and the environmental movement, which I think was a kind of a blind spot for the animal welfare movement in those early years. They didn't really understand or conceive. They had an inkling. They understood about the extermination of the American bison, or the shooting of egrets for ladies' hats. These sorts of wider environmental issues. But I think that we have many more organizations that are more specialized now. I mean, the SPCA does focus, I think, among other things, but primarily about pets.
Well, yeah, yeah. What do you think about the continuous cruelty towards animals in regards to, for example, bullfights? You know, you got a matador just torturing a poor bull to death, or rodeos, or I don't know. I grew up in Colombia,
Mm.
and there we still have chicken fights.
Yeah.
That's, and I was horrified the first time I saw a chicken fight, and then of course you build some tolerance, and then you learn to see it as amusement, I guess,
Yeah.
until you are waking up, and see how horrible this is. But where are we lacking still in regard to the fight against animal cruelty?
Well, I think in many places, I mean, one of the things that struck me in thinking about what Bergh was doing, he was able to tap people's consciences because he was able to point to visible cruelty in the streets. You
Right.
know, the mistreatment of horses, and I think, you know, maybe the slaughter of livestock is a good example of this. Back in his day, there were slaughterhouses, you know, all over the city, and people even went and watched animals being slaughtered as entertainment. And you know, all the environmental problems of having livestock in the middle of downtown Manhattan and other places were very evident. Bergh was a big advocate for taking this out of the city and rationalizing it, you know. But in the end, that produced factory farming, right?
Right.
And so the cruelty is you know, the animal rights activists who are working on this issue now have to work very hard to make people see what's going on behind their dinner plate. You know, and
Which
there are states that are passing laws that are making it illegal to go in and video this
Right.
material. You know, there's a constant struggle for this. So in that way, I think some of the issues are invisible. Right?
Right. But still, there is a movement. For example, now if you go to the supermarket at a higher price, you see free range eggs, for example. So I guess people
Yeah.
are willing to pay a premium price for chickens that have been raised without cruelty, let's say. And now there is, of course, the new companies like Beyond Meat, or what is it, Beyond Meat or Impossible Meats or something like that. So I
Right.
think there is a awareness of this factory farming, I mean
Yes.
animal farming, and people are, there's like a new movement. Sure, it's not visible animal cruelty to our everyday eyes, but we are aware of it, and a lot of people are just jumping into this trend.
Yes, I think that's right. And because of the work of these activists who are doing what they can to make us aware and get us to think about this, you know, that it's very easy for us to think of our practices as just, you know, as you're suggesting with in Colombia, you know, this is just tradition. This is part of the culture. You know, cockfighting would be, you know, why would that be considered morally problematic? So it takes these activists to kind of prod the rest of us to think more carefully about what we're doing, and to, you know, it's very easy for us to not worry about it.
Right. Professor Freeberg, anything going on for you? Any other plans for the future? What would be the next thing on your the next book on your list?
Well, I'm actually thinking about, this is a little shift in direction, but I'm going to write a book, I think, about the history of retirement as a concept. And my
Nice.
idea my idea is that sometime after World War II, people began to think of retirement as a distinctive part of life that was between work and old age, and that you had an opportunity. You were supposed to work your whole life, set aside money, and then when you hit 65 or 70 or 60 or whatever it might be, you were supposed to do something different with your life. And so I'm interested in what people thought they should do with their life. And
Wow.
uh, I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, it strikes me, I as a professor, I'm constantly in debates and reading about the problems of the decline of the humanities. You know, that people are not interested in history and philosophy and literature anymore as the way they were. I don't think that's true. I think 19-year-olds may not be interested in it as much. You know, they tend to be taking more practical majors, perhaps. Uh, but I give lots of lectures, and people who are retired love to learn more, right? So I think
Yeah.
the humanities are alive and well for older people. So that's part,
I
that's part of the story I want to explore.
I don't know. I think young people are interested in it, but they are forced to be quote unquote realistic and take a
Yes.
computer class or accounting class because, of course, if you get all that amount of debt to pay for your education, you have to pay it somehow. And usually, an English degree is not the best way to pay
Yeah.
for you hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt. Wow,
That's what they say.
Professor Freeberg, this has been an amazing conversation. Where can people, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where people can buy it?
Yeah, it's a traitor to his species, Henry Bergh and the Birth of Animal Rights. And Basic Books sells it, and I hope they manage to get it into everybody's independent bookstore.
I went to my independent bookstore right here in Montreal and they have it. So, yeah, this is
I'm glad to hear that.
we have to highlight this to the reader. We don't want the elimination of all these little bookstore that makes little towns or cities a place to gather and just to get out of the house. So Amazon is very convenient, but if we can support the little bookstores, that would be even better.
I agree.
Professor Freeberg, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.